Okay. Most of my co-therapists in the hospital were Gestalt therapists, and quite frankly, they drove me crazy because all they ever did was talk about feelings. You know, they would say, "What are you feeling now?" You know, some patient in group therapy would go on and on about things from their past. And you know, one whole problem with psychoanalysis and Gestalt therapy is there's too much focus on the past. In fact, the real problem with psychoanalysis is to do it right, you should see the therapist 5 or 6 times a week for 20 years. Well, nobody's insurance is going to pay for that, and who's got that kind of money to pay for it themselves? The other problem with psychoanalysis is it doesn't work with people with below average intelligence. I'm not even sure it works that well with people that have only average intelligence. You really need a fairly bright person to understand the insight into what's coming out of their unconscious. And so, you know, you need a bright patient who's got lots of money. And so, you know, this is a real problem with psychoanalysis. A real problem with Gestalt therapy, by the same token, is this focus on the patient's unfinished business. And so, you know, they spend all their time talking about their feelings, about how badly they were treated when they were younger and this sort of thing. You know, I'd be in group therapy and my co-therapist would encourage somebody to talk about their feelings, and they'd go on and on and on, and maybe they'd start crying or maybe they'd yell or something, and then the therapist would say, "What are you feeling now?" And then they'd go on for another 5 minutes or so, and then they'd look at somebody else in the group and say, "How are you feeling about what she just said?" And I'd be sitting there thinking, I feel like I want to get out of here. So there's a real emphasis on feelings. If we go back to this case I was talking about the gentleman whose father was an Army officer, a good Gestalt therapist would say, well, you know, you did a good job telling me how I reminded you of your dad, and it brought up all kinds of feelings that you shared with me. What I'd like you to do now is, can you go ahead and call your dad and tell him those things? And, you know, the patient might say, well, no, I can't. My father's no longer living. He's dead. Well, a Gestalt therapist would do it. They call the empty chair technique. Oh no, your father's right here. He's sitting in this chair. Can you express those feelings to him? I hate you. You were never around for me when I was growing up. You were always off fighting a war somewhere. You didn't come to any of my ball games. And then the therapist would say, now how do you feel, Dan? Now that you told your father those things. So it was this emphasis on feelings. Although other approaches of therapy would say, you know, just getting all your feelings out doesn't necessarily make your anxiety go away or your depression go away or something like that. It might make you feel better, but it doesn't necessarily make you get better. My favorite psychiatrist of all time, William Glasser, who's the father of reality therapy. Had his own term for unfinished business, and Glasser called it psychiatric garbage. Glasser believed that focusing on the past and blaming all your problems on things from your past doesn't help you get better. He would say people need to be responsible for their own behavior. And somebody else who would fit in right here is Viktor Frankl. Another psychiatrist. He's the father of what we call existential therapy. And what I would tell you about Viktor Frankl is if there was ever someone who should have had lots of unfinished business, it would be Viktor Frankl. And that's because he spent many years as a prisoner in a Nazi concentration camp. And while he was there, besides seeing all kinds, hundreds and maybe thousands of other prisoners die in that camp, he also lost all the members of his family, everyone he cared about, everybody he loved. Surely he should have had lots of unfinished business, but Viktor Frankl's attitude was, when the war was over, when he finally got out of a concentration camp and had survived, his attitude was, I can be angry at the Nazis for the rest of my life for what they did to me and my loved ones, or I can get on with my life. And, what he said basically is this: I am responsible for my own mental health. The Nazis aren't responsible for my mental health. I'm responsible for my own mental health. Something that Glasser emphasized in his approach to reality therapy is that the person is responsible for their own mental health, for their own behavior. But another person that I would add to this whole mix right here is a psychologist by the name of Carl Rogers. He's a PhD. And he's the father of what we call client-centered therapy. Rogers said if you're going to help someone, you have to establish a genuine relationship with that person. And by that he meant no matter what the client says, you're going to accept that person, you're not going to act shocked, and you're going to continue working with them. Rogers' biggest contribution perhaps was getting rid of the medical model and coming up with what he called the client-centered model. And, what Rogers said was, no, these aren't patients who are sick. These are clients who have life issues. And I'm not a doctor who's going to heal them. I'm a counselor who's going to educate them, educate the client how to help themselves. Help themselves. And back to this, the way that you would do that and help the client to help themselves is, first of all, to establish a genuine relationship with the client, as I said a moment ago. That means no matter what they say, no matter what they do, you're not going to reject them, and so on. And one of the main ways that you do this is by treating the client with what Rogers calls unconditional positive regard. Unconditional positive regard. And what that is no matter what the client says, no matter what the client does, you're not going to reject the client. You have a genuine relationship with the person. What a genuine relationship also means is that you are glad you're working with the client and the client's glad they're working with you. I'm not sure how many people I ever helped that didn't want to be working with me. And unfortunately, I treated lots of children and adolescents who didn't want to be there. Their parents made them come and they weren't happy about it. I discovered in all the years I did counseling at ACC, in the Office for Students with Disabilities, I loved counseling and I was really good at counseling. And you know why? Because everybody coming in my office wanted to be there. They wanted to talk. They had issues they wanted to address. You can't imagine how much more productive you feel when you have a client who's like that compared to somebody who was made to come. In other words, when I had a private practice, it was always good to look at my appointment book for the day and say, oh good, so-and-so's coming today. I can't wait to see her. I can't wait to see him. As opposed to looking at my appointment book and going, oh no, look at who my 2 o'clock appointment is. Well, maybe he won't show up. Maybe I'll luck out. That's not having a genuine relationship with someone. Having a genuine relationship means they want to be there and you want them to be there. And those are the people that you really help. There are probably some people that didn't want to be there that I ended up helping. But over the years, I've gotten some letters in the mail from teenagers I treated decades ago that said, I hated coming to see you, but now that I'm adult, I just wanted you to know that I really benefited from all the stuff we did together, and I wanted you to know that. So it's good to get that kind of feedback eventually. But back to this client-centered therapy thing, and treating someone with unconditional positive regard. I have to tell you a story about one client I had that I think best illustrates unconditional positive regard. This client was visually impaired. He had lost his vision in an industrial accident where there had been an explosion. And he had come to Austin from the city that he had lived in before to get mobility training at the School for the Blind and so on. And he came to see me weekly for therapy. And we did a number of things. One, deal with his remorse over losing his eyesight. And then we did a lot of career counseling. What can I do now that I've lost my vision and that sort of thing. He had a seeing eye dog that he'd bring with him, and he would come in a taxi cab and so on. Loved working with this guy. He had a great sense of humor. Just one of my all-time favorite clients. Really enjoyed working with him. Well, one day he came and he said that he was going to be going to Houston, that there was some kind of special surgery that some eye specialist there was doing. And if it worked, he might be able to have his vision partially restored. If it didn't work, there would be no chance it would ever happen again. And we talked about that, his anxiety about going to Houston for the surgery and all that. Anyway, to make a long story short, about 2 weeks later, he came back in and the surgery didn't work. And now he had no chance of ever having any vision whatsoever. But what was worse was they had given him some pain medication, and he had had a bad reaction to the pain medication. In fact, it caused hallucinations and delusions. If you can imagine someone who's blind suddenly seeing pink elephants on parade kind of thing. Well, he came to my office, and I mentioned before, he had a great sense of humor. I loved talking to him, but all of a sudden, his face was just blank. He had what we call flat affect, and he spoke in a more robotic manner, like someone who's psychotic would. This bad reaction to this pain medication had caused a psychotic reaction. So he was suicidal, and he told me he felt like he had died and gone to hell, and I tried to joke with him, and I said, "Oh, that makes me a hell of a psychologist." And he didn't laugh. So I knew I was in trouble, because he would have laughed at a comment like that before. He was suicidal. I couldn't let him leave my office in the condition he was in. And so rather than have a cab take him home, this guy lived in some apartments over by the University of Texas, and he got some of the guys who lived next door to him to come and get him. They made sure that somebody stayed with him all the time, and this went on for a couple of days, where these 3 guys that lived next door, somebody would sleep on his couch all the time. Whoever wasn't going to class would be at home watching over my client. Well, this couldn't continue. These guys had to get on with their lives, and so I admitted him to Shoal Creek Hospital. And I went to see him in the hospital, and there was a psychiatrist that gave him some antipsychotic medication and so on. Anyway, I went to see him that first day in the hospital, and he said, again, he was talking about what a wretch he was and how he deserved to go to hell and all this kind of stuff. And I said, I don't know why you say these things. You haven't done anything that's any worse than anybody else I've ever counseled. I don't know why you're so down on yourself. You're just not acting like yourself at all. Anyway, at the end of the session, I said, well, I'll be back again tomorrow at 3 o'clock. I did my rounds at the hospital in those days. In about the middle of the afternoon, I said, I'll see you again tomorrow at 3 o'clock. He said, before you go, I've got something I want to give you. And I said, what's that? And he handed me a 120-minute cassette tape. You remember cassette players? Aren't you glad they went out? Those darn things, the tapes would get stuck inside them and break and come unraveled and all sorts of things. I'm glad we don't have them anymore, but this is back in the days of the popularity of cassette tapes. And he handed me this 120-minute cassette tape, 60 minutes on each side. And he said, I recorded this tape before I went to Houston, just in case I had died during surgery. And he said, I had more things I wanted to get off of my chest. And on this tape, I talk about all the bad things I've done in my life. And he said, I'm giving it to you now. And he said, I realize after you listen to it, you'll never want to have anything more to do with me, and I'll never see you again. And I'm like, I don't know why you say these things. you had never done anything worse than anybody else. I've heard all kinds of stories. He said, he handed me the tape, and I said, I'll listen to it. I said, I'll see you again tomorrow at 3. And he looked at me seriously and he said, if you listen to the tape, I will not see you tomorrow at 3. You will never have anything to do with me again. And I walked out the door and I said, I'll see you at 3 tomorrow. So I got in my car and started driving home. I had a cassette player in my car in those days, and I popped that tape in my cassette player. Whoa, I almost drove off the road. I could not believe what was on that tape. There was so much awful stuff that I have repressed 90% of it into my unconscious. I still have the tape. One of these days I'm going to get a cassette player and replay it, make a list of all the stuff this guy said. It was unbelievable. I thought, whoa, you are a wretch. I listened to the whole 2 hours. And then the next day I walked into his room and he said, what are you doing here? I said, it's 3 o'clock. I told you I'd be here at 3 o'clock. He said, you didn't listen to the tape? I said, oh yeah, I listened to the tape. Yes, I listened to it. Thank you for sharing it with me. I finally understand why you've had such a hard time forgiving yourself. Because there are he and I had been counseling every week for a year, but there was stuff on the tape he had never shared with me, and the few things I can remember that I hadn't repressed was about how his wife had divorced him and she had their kids, custody of their kids, and that was something else that we would talk about in counseling because he missed his kids. He had 3 boys. And, I just thought it was shocking that his wife had divorced him and then married his cousin. Until I listened to the tape and found out that all of his cousin's kids were actually his, that he had had sex with his cousin's wife. And those kids were all his. In fact, most of the kids in their neighborhood were his. And then he talked about the times he beat his wife and all this stuff. This is the stuff I hadn't repressed in my unconscious. So I said to him, thank you for sharing the tape with me. Now I finally understand why it's been so hard for you to forgive yourself. But it hasn't changed our relationship at all. You're still one of my favorite clients. I love working with you, and I'm here today, and I'll be here tomorrow, and I'll be here the day after that. And when you finally get discharged from the hospital, I'll see you every week again in my office. It hasn't changed anything. In other words, I treated him with unconditional positive regard. Something that Rogers and Glasser and Frankel, I think, would agree on is this. The client is responsible for their own mental health. And Glasser would take this a step further and say the client is responsible for his or her own behavior. Don't blame your problems on somebody else. Don't say I'm depressed because of what so-and-so did to me, or I'm anxious because of what so-and-so did to me. They aren't causing your depression, your anxiety. You are choosing. Glasser has now changed reality therapy into what he calls choice theory, and he would say, you are choosing to be unhappy. You are responsible for your own mental health. You are responsible for your own happiness. you, to a great extent, are responsible for your own misery. Don't blame it on someone else. Okay.